When the Watchmen story was originally published in 1986, it completely revolutionized the comic industry. This is because through its 2 issues, it criticized and deconstructed the superhero figure, inviting us to see these iconic characters from a completely different point of view, where they were not always good people trying to do good, but characters full of flaws, defects, and even mental problems. Years later, the boys did something very similar. First, through the comic, where it openly criticized superheroes through various characters that parodied teams and famous names from other companies, and then through the series, which in addition to criticizing superheroes themselves, used them to talk about very current social and political issues. Both stories are highly acclaimed, both cultural products were a watershed for superhero stories, but which of these 2 comics has more weight in the history of superheroes? And which one proposes a more effective critique? That's what we're going to talk about today as we analyze the differences, similarities, and points in favor and against each of these 2 stories to discover it. This way you form an opinion, but I'm also going to give you my personal verdict, something that will be difficult because I really love these 2 stories. My name is Go, the Geek Monitor, and today we're going to take Watchmen and The Voice in the same video and seriously, I Go the Geek Monitor. I think a good starting point to begin analyzing these 2 stories is to know how the Watchmen comic was born. The Watchmen comic was the result of an accidental creation. In the mid-80s, a comic company called Charlton, who owned characters like Blue Beetle, Peacemaker, and The Question, declared bankruptcy, so DC Comics decided to buy it. When this happened, Alan Moore, who was a fan of these characters and of superheroes in general at that time, had an idea for his new story. Use these Charlton characters in a mini-series that felt transgressive and explored themes such as power, morality, and human psychology. However, when he presented his comic story, it was rejected because it basically left these characters that the company had just bought useless for future stories. So DC's editor Dick Giordano suggested to Moore to create original characters for his story. That's how The Question became Rorschach, Blue Beetle became Night Owl, Captain Atom became Dr. Manhattan, Thunderbolt became Ozymandias, Nightshade became Silk Spectre, and Peacemaker became the Comedian, which ultimately proved to be very beneficial. Since instead of using specific characters in the plot, it used archetypal characters that worked to tell us not only about one character, but about several simultaneously. For example, Night Owl not only represents Blue Beetle, but it tells us about all these human superheroes who are usually millionaires and who use gadgets like Batman, Green Arrow, and we could even talk about elements of Iron Man, which made Watchmen feel like a story that tells us not about superheroes in general and not just a few characters, as would have been the case originally. Similarly, the 2006 comic The Boys by Garth Ennis uses parodies of themes like the Justice League, Avengers, and X-Men. However, there's a big difference, that the comic The Boys really doesn't take the time to explore most of these characters. Firstly, because there are many more than those presented in Watchmen, so we don't fully know their motivations or personality. It's as if the comic treats these superheroes more as archetypes than as characters. For example, when you see the Deep in the comic, you, as a reader, assume that he is the equivalent to Aquaman and associate everything that the Deep does with him. This makes sense within this narrative because it's a critique of superheroes in general. But on the other hand, Watchmen, having fewer characters, develops a plot where you can perfectly understand the motivations of each of the characters because each of them fulfills an important function within the plot and contributes in their own way to form the great story that is Watchmen.
The interesting thing is that Watchmen, despite having few characters, still manages to tell us about many more superheroes, since its archetypes are not as specific as those we see in The Boys, where Soldier Boy, for example, is clearly an alternate version of Captain America and serves as a specific critique of Captain America.
The openness of Watchmen's characters, incorporating elements from others, allows the story to reveal insights about more characters than are directly presented. Now, The Boys series is a separate issue. This series introduces several metahumans like the comic, but focuses on developing a small number of characters very well throughout the seasons. A prime example of this is the character A-Train. It's very obvious that the Boys series A-Train is an analog of Flash. However, the series uses this character to discuss many other topics unrelated to Flash or speedsters. In the first season, for example, it talked about this social obsession we have with fame as we saw him consuming Compound B to maintain his place in the Seven and the sponsorships that come with it, which worked as a critique of these athletes who are no longer at their best but consume substances to continue competing. Later, we saw him adopt a role where he supposedly was proud of his African roots, but really, it was all a facade with which he wanted to continue being relevant within the team. The topic of tokenism and how companies exploit social movements for profit resonated with us. It also addressed the issue of police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement through the character of Blue Hawk, who was basically a cop who assaulted African descendants. And we've even recently seen him take on a more interesting role, where he starts to question all the terrible deeds he has done throughout the series. How happy he is and how fulfilled he feels with this artificial fame that comes with being a Vought superhero. So little by little, we have seen him help Huey's team more selflessly. And we have seen it in small moments where he feels more fulfilled through a good deed. Something that doesn't feel out of nowhere because he has always been a character looking to fill an inner void. He just doesn't know how. At first it was with fame, later with a false purpose, and eventually through small actions that could well make a difference in the fight against Vought and Homelander. If you notice, it has nothing to do with the comic, because the greatest value of the series is not in its criticism of superheroes, but in how it uses superheroes to criticize the society in which we live. In this regard, Watchmen is not left behind. Let's remember that this comic was written during the historical period known as the Cold War, an unarmed conflict where the United States and the Soviet Union competed to see who had more political power. And each of these powers indirectly threatened the other by testing nuclear weapons. So many writers of this time lived with the constant fear of a nuclear war. A powerful theme throughout Watchmen's history, where Dr. Manhattan, for example, is presented as a character who has the ability to destroy entire cities, a living nuclear bomb that the United States is happy to have because they believe he is on their side. Just as they were happy to have on their side the atomic power they developed precisely in the Manhattan Project during World War II. However, when they start to believe that this power might also be dangerous for them, things start to get out of control. I enjoyed this aspect more in Zack Snyder's adaptation compared to the comic, which presents Dr. Manhattan as a direct threat to both powers, just as nuclear bombs were in their time. Another point where both stories excel is in how they deconstruct the superhero figure. But first, what is this deconstruction? Deconstruction involves analyzing an idea or concept piece by piece to understand it better. It questions concepts that are often taken for granted. This helps you find parts that don't fit, might be weaker, or are essential. In the case of superheroes, for example, the general belief before stories like Watchmen was that they were good people with a very strong moral guide. But Watchmen made us see these characters very differently. Watchmen made us question superheroes more than any other comic had before. It made us see that those dark and violent vigilantes probably have mental issues, that if there was a person with godlike powers, we might be too insignificant for them to care about us, and that those characters with superior intelligence might come to the conclusion that they need to manipulate society for our own good. Watchmen also questions the aesthetics of superhero bodies, a topic not often discussed. Since we are regularly used to seeing super athletic bodies, but this comic tells us that even those humans who have achieved great physical capacity can deteriorate due to lack of practice, depression, and the passage of time. So we see Night Owl as a repressed man, unable to have sex and whose body is no longer in shape. It also speaks to us through the comedian about the possibility that some of these great vigilantes, particularly those who are so good with weapons, are sociopaths who are not seeking justice but an excuse to live within a conflict. Nowadays, these types of stories that make us question are more common, but at the time, Watchmen laid the foundations for a new generation of stories, among them the comic The Boys. However, the comic really doesn't aim for much. Its basic message is that all metahumans are horrible people because power corrupts. In this sense, it is very different from Watchmen. Because in Alan Moore's story, each character makes us question an aspect of superheroes that we considered sacred. While in the comic The Boys, they basically dedicate many pages to presenting us with the most vile, violent, and bizarre acts you can imagine. The characters all reach the same conclusion, which is why I don't like the comic. The series, however, presents more complex themes, in my opinion, because each of the characters, particularly within the Seven, is used to make a social critique. We've already talked about A-Train, but in the same way we can talk about how the Deep is this person insecure with his own body, who feels that he has to reinforce his confidence by dominating and subjugating other people. How Starlight comes from a hypocritical Christian environment that praise Bible verses while selling their children to companies like bots. And above all, we can talk about Homelander, a character who throughout the series has been the equivalent of Donald Trump. A character who is admired by some, detested by others, hypocritical with his Christian values, and who presents great power in public, but who is also insecure in secret. Someone who, no matter what he does and commits the crimes he commits, will continue to have the support of a large sector of people as they think he is the solution to many of their problems. So, which of these stories makes a better critique? I think this depends on the goal you're looking for in that critique, because both stories have different objectives. Watchmen is a political story whose main objective is to question superheroes, while the Boys series is a superhero story whose main objective is to criticize politics. It seems similar, but it's a very different approach. So if we're talking about which story is more important for superheroes, I'd go for Watchmen. Because through just 2 issues, it managed to lay the groundwork for what would be the superhero stories for the next 30 years. If we're talking about criticizing political issues, maybe at first I'd go with The Voice. Since it talks about many problems that we are experiencing today, but that can also be a disadvantage. Because yes, it talks about the current political landscape, and that's why the series feels so relevant. But I don't know how long-lasting this discourse will be. That is, I don't know if in 30 years we can watch this series and understand all these little details and references that we lived in 2024, since I feel that sometimes its discourse is too specific to represent our time, something that does not happen with Watchmen, as it talks about the political feeling of an entire historical era, the Cold War, and focuses more on broad and relevant themes and not on such particular cases. And it's funny because these very specific political and social references are what I love about The Boys, but I also feel that they are the ones that could cause this message to be lost in the future. Nearly 4 decades post-publication, Watchmen remains a watershed moment in history. A must-read for every fan of comics and superheroes, and a story that continues to give us something to talk about, as every time you read the comic, you find new narratives and details that make you appreciate even more this great gem by Alan Moore. I love stories that are very special to me, but in my opinion, there is still no superhero story that rivals in narrative, historical influence, and execution with the beautiful story that is Watchmen. But I would love for you to tell me in the comments if you agree or if you feel that The Voice is a more important story for or the superheroes. Leave your comments here so the conversation doesn't stop. That's all for today. I am Go, the Geek Monitor, and keep looking beyond the obvious. Thank you.